The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, blending with the muffled hum of machinery and the occasional distant murmur of voices. For Samantha Reynolds, this was just another night shift at St. Anne's Hospital, or at least that's what she thought, before the commotion erupted in the emergency room. The man who had just been wheeled in on a gurney was no ordinary patient. The staff whispered in hushed tones, their voices tinged with awe and disbelief. "That's him," one nurse murmured, eyes wide. "Elliot Grayson, the billionaire." Samantha glanced up from her clipboard. Elliot Grayson was a household name, a tech mogul whose innovations had revolutionized industries and whose fortune seemed limitless. But beyond his fame there was something else. Rumors swirled about his peculiar condition, a rare, debilitating allergy to physical contact with women. It was the subject of tabloid headlines and late-night talk show jokes, but Samantha had always dismissed it as gossip. Yet here he was, unconscious, pale against the stark white hospital sheets. His tailored suit, now torn and bloodied, was a far cry from the polished image he projected on magazine covers. A car accident, she overheard. He'd skidded on black ice and collided with a guardrail. Minor injuries, but he'd lost consciousness from the shock. "He needs to be cleaned up before the doctor arrives," the head nurse said, glancing around the room. "Samantha, you're up." Her heart sank. "Me? Are you sure?" The head nurse raised an eyebrow. "You're one of the most capable nurses here. Just follow protocol. He's sedated. It's unlikely he'll even wake." Samantha hesitated. She was no stranger to difficult patients, but the idea of bathing a man who couldn't bear to be touched by women felt like stepping into a minefield. Still, she nodded, her professionalism taking over. In the dimly lit room, she gathered the necessary supplies and approached the bed. Elliot's face was obscured by a shadow of stubble, his dark hair tousled from the crash. Up close, he looked almost human, vulnerable even. It was a stark contrast to the cold, untouchable image he was known for. Samantha took a deep breath, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she dipped a cloth into warm water. She worked methodically, cleaning away the dirt and dried blood from his arms and chest. Every movement was precise, cautious, as if she were navigating a razor-thin line between care and trespass. Midway through, his eyelids flickered. Samantha froze. A low groan escaped his lips, and his eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of storm clouds. For a moment, they were unfocused, dazed. Then they locked onto her. "Where?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Where am I?" "You're at St. Anne's Hospital," Samantha said softly, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. "You were in an accident. You're safe now." His gaze flicked downward, taking in the wet cloth in her hand and the damp towel draped across his torso. A flicker of realization crossed his face, followed swiftly by panic. "Stop," he rasped, his body tensing. Don't touch me." Samantha stepped back immediately, her hands raised in surrender. "I'm sorry. You had injuries that needed cleaning. I was just following medical protocol." Elliot struggled to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his ribs. His breathing quickened, and for a moment, Samantha worried he might hyperventilate. She reached for the call button. "Wait," he said, his voice steadier now, though still laced with tension. "I'm fine. Just give me a moment." She hesitated, watching as he took a series of measured breaths, his composure gradually returning. His movements were deliberate, as if every action required meticulous control. "I heard about you," she admitted after a pause, her tone gentle. "About your condition. I understand if this is difficult." His eyes narrowed slightly, a shield of defensiveness rising. "You don't understand," he said curtly. "No one does." Samantha met his gaze evenly. "Maybe not, but I do know that everyone deserves compassion, Mr. Grayson. Even you." For a moment, something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor, a glimpse of vulnerability, but just as quickly it was gone. "Compassion," he muttered, leaning back against the pillows. "That's a new one." Samantha's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You'd be surprised how far it can go." She busied herself tidying the supplies, giving him space to process, but as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Wait." She turned back, surprised to see hesitation flickering across his face. "What's your name?" he asked. "Samantha. Samantha Reynolds." He nodded slowly, as if committing the name to memory. "Thank you, Samantha." The words were simple, but coming from him, they felt monumental. She nodded in return and stepped out, closing the door quietly behind her. Outside, the chatter among the staff continued, speculation running wild. Samantha ignored it, her thoughts lingering on the man she had just met. There was something about him, something beneath the guarded exterior and clinical diagnosis that intrigued her. And unbeknownst to her, inside that hospital room, Elliot Grayson was thinking the same thing. For the first time in years, he felt something other than isolation. He couldn't name it yet, but it was enough to unsettle him. That night, as Samantha walked down the sterile corridors of St. Anne's, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life and his had just shifted in a way neither of them could predict. The hospital buzzed with its usual rhythm, heels clicking against linoleum floors, monitors beeping softly in the background, and the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. But for Samantha, the night had taken an unusual turn. Her mind kept replaying the moments with Elliot Grayson, the intensity of his gaze, the vulnerability hidden beneath layers of guarded hostility. She couldn't quite place what unsettled her about him. Maybe it was the loneliness in his eyes or the way he'd thanked her, as if the words were foreign to him. Regardless, she knew she'd likely never see him again. Patients came and went, especially the wealthy ones. They often transferred to private facilities within hours of stabilization. But Elliot Grayson wasn't like other patients. Elliot stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched, his ribs ached. But that wasn't what gnawed at him. It was her, Samantha. The way her voice had steadied him when his instincts screamed to run, to push her away. It wasn't her fault, he reminded himself. She had no idea the weight of what her touch had meant, how it sent electricity through his body. Not from attraction, but from raw, visceral panic. He closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. For years he'd managed his condition with unyielding discipline. He structured his life to avoid physical contact, insulating himself in layers of power and wealth. Meetings were virtual, bodyguards maintained distance, and even his romantic encounters, if they could be called that, were meticulously controlled. But Samantha had disrupted that control, albeit unintentionally. A knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. The head nurse stepped in, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Grayson, we've arranged for your transfer to a private facility," she said, her tone professional but impersonal. "Your team has already signed off on the arrangements." "Cancel it," Elliot said flatly. The nurse blinked, clearly taken aback. "Cancel it? Sir, the facility—" "I said cancel it." His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "Very well," she replied after a pause. "I'll notify the staff." As she left, Elliot's mind churned. Staying at St. Anne's was reckless, but he couldn't ignore the nagging curiosity that kept him rooted. Something about Samantha's presence had quieted the chaos in his head, if only briefly. For a man accustomed to solitude, it was unsettling and strangely compelling. Samantha was halfway through a fresh round of patient charts when she saw his name listed for rounds. "He's staying," she muttered under her breath. The head nurse raised an eyebrow. "You sound surprised." "I just assumed someone like him would, leave." "Well, he hasn't. And you're on his care rotation for the next shift," the nurse replied. "Try not to rattle him too much." Samantha snorted softly. "I think it's the other way around." She approached Elliot's room with trepidation, the memory of their first encounter still vivid. This time, she knocked lightly before entering. "Good evening, Mr. Grayson," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "I'm here to check your vitals." Elliot sat up straighter, his expression unreadable. "Samantha," he said, his voice a touch softer than before, "I was hoping you'd stop by." Her eyebrows rose slightly, but she maintained her composure. "How are you feeling?" "Better," he admitted, "though I can't say I'm used to this kind of hospitality." She smiled faintly. "We do our best." As she worked, adjusting monitors and jotting down notes, the silence between them stretched. Finally, Elliot spoke. "I imagine you've heard the rumors about me." She hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I've heard a few things. They're mostly true," he said bluntly. "I can't tolerate physical contact. It's not a choice. It's a condition. An allergy, if you want to call it that." Samantha met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "That must be difficult." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Difficult is one way to put it. It's isolating. People think money makes up for it, but they're wrong. You can buy distance, but not connection." The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. It wasn't what she expected from a man like him, someone who wielded power like a shield. She set her clipboard aside, choosing her words carefully. Connection doesn't have to come from touch, she said. It can come from understanding. Elliot studied her, his expression inscrutable. And you think you understand me? Not entirely, she admitted. But I'd like to try. The air between them shifted, heavy with unspoken tension. For a moment, Samantha thought she'd crossed a line, but then Elliot's lips quirked into a faint smile. You're not what I expected, he said. Neither are you, she replied, her tone light but honest. The days that followed blurred into a strange rhythm. Elliot remained at the hospital, insisting on continuing his recovery there, despite the protestations of his staff. Samantha found herself assigned to him more often than not, their interactions growing increasingly layered. She learned he wasn't as cold as he appeared. Beneath the sharp exterior was a man burdened by his own humanity, constantly at odds with a world that demanded he play a role he despised. And Elliot, in turn, found himself drawn to Samantha's quiet resilience. She didn't fawn over him or treat him like a spectacle. She simply saw him. But the calm couldn't last. One evening, as Samantha prepared to leave, she was stopped by a commotion near the hospital's entrance. A swarm of reporters had gathered, cameras flashing and voices clamoring for attention. At the center of it all was Elliot, flanked by his bodyguards. The news of his hospitalization had leaked, and the media frenzy was in full swing. Samantha watched from a distance as Elliot navigated the chaos with practiced indifference, his face a mask of composure. But when their eyes met briefly across the crowd, she saw the exhaustion lurking beneath. Later that night, she found him in his room, sitting by the window with his back to the door. I take it the press found out, she said gently. They always do, he replied, his voice weary. Privacy is a luxury I lost a long time ago. She hesitated before stepping closer. Why do you put up with it? Elliot turned to face her, his expression shadowed. Because it's the price of power. And power is the only thing that keeps the world at arm's length. That sounds lonely, she said softly. It is, he admitted, the words carrying a weight that seemed to hang in the air. Samantha crossed her arms, her gaze steady. You don't have to live like that, you know. There are other ways to find peace. Elliot laughed bitterly. Peace isn't for people like me, Samantha. It's for those who can afford to be vulnerable. The words struck her, not because of their harshness, but because of the truth they held. For all his wealth and influence, Elliot was a prisoner of his own life, trapped by walls he'd built to protect himself. But what he didn't realize was that those walls were starting to crack. As the night wore on, Elliot found himself replaying Samantha's words. There was a sincerity in her that unnerved him, a refusal to be swayed by his cynicism. He couldn't remember the last time someone had challenged him so openly, without fear or ulterior motives, and Samantha, in turn, found herself drawn to the complexity of Elliot Grayson. He wasn't just a billionaire or a recluse. He was a man fighting a battle most people couldn't see. A man who, despite his aversion to touch, was desperate for connection. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives were about to collide in ways neither could have anticipated. The rain hammered against the hospital windows, its rhythmic patter an unwelcome soundtrack to the chaos unfolding inside. Samantha glanced up from the nurse's station, her stomach knotting as she caught sight of the commotion near Elliot Grayson's room. A handful of sharply dressed men and women, no doubt his legal team, were engaged in a heated exchange with hospital staff. Mr. Grayson has made his decision, one of the lawyers snapped, his tone clipped. He won't leave the hospital, and that's final. We're here to ensure his privacy is respected. The head nurse looked unimpressed. This is a hospital, not a fortress. We're doing everything we can, but if you want complete security, I suggest moving him to a private facility. Samantha sighed, watching the scene unfold. She had no doubt Elliot was behind this. He seemed determined to stay, despite the inconvenience it caused everyone around him. She couldn't decide if it was stubbornness or something else. Hey, a fellow nurse nudged her. Your billionaire is causing quite a stir. He's not my anything, Samantha muttered, though her cheeks warmed at the implication. She grabbed her clipboard and headed toward his room, weaving through the cluster of suits. Inside, Elliot sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the rain-soaked skyline. He looked out of place, like a king dethroned yet still clinging to an air of command. His suit jacket had been replaced with a hospital gown, but the aura of control remained. "Trouble outside?" he asked without turning, his voice dry. "You could say that," Samantha replied, stepping closer. "Your legal team is practically at war with the staff." "They mean well," he said, his tone indifferent. But they tend to overdo it. Samantha crossed her arms, studying him. Why are you still here, Elliot? You have the resources to recover anywhere. So why this hospital? His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he turned to face her, his expression guarded. Maybe I'm tired of running, he admitted. Tired of hiding. The words caught her off guard. She'd expected deflection, not honesty. It was becoming a pattern with him, these fleeting glimpses of vulnerability that made it hard to keep her distance. Well, she said after a pause, you might want to let your team know that. They're making it hard for anyone to focus. A faint smile tugged at his lips. I'll talk to them, but first I need your help. My help? She arched an eyebrow. I want to see the hospital, he said simply. Samantha blinked. See the hospital? Why? Because I've spent my life looking at the world from behind walls, he said, his voice low. And for once, I'd like to step outside them. She hesitated. It wasn't exactly standard procedure to escort a patient on a private tour, let alone one with his profile. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet plea that made it hard to say no. Fine, she said at last. But you follow my rules. No detours, no interruptions. Deal, he said, standing with a wince. His movements were stiff, a reminder of the injuries he was still recovering from. Samantha grabbed a wheelchair, insisting he use it despite his protests. As they moved through the halls, Elliot's presence drew curious stares and whispers. Samantha ignored them, focusing on the man beside her. He seemed different outside the confines of his room, less guarded, almost curious. They passed the pediatric ward, where a group of children were playing with toys donated by hospital patrons. Elliot slowed, his gaze softening as he watched a little boy carefully assemble a puzzle. Samantha noticed the shift in his expression and spoke gently. Do you like kids? She asked. I don't know, he admitted. I've never spent much time around them. My life hasn't exactly been conducive to family. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken regret. Samantha wanted to ask more, but sensed it wasn't the right moment. As they continued, they passed the oncology wing, where patients sat in recliners receiving treatment. One of them, an older man with a kind face, caught Elliot's eye and gave him a small nod. Elliot returned the gesture, something unspoken passing between them. You don't seem like the type to avoid difficult things, Samantha observed. Elliot glanced at her. I've faced plenty of challenges, but this is different. There's no negotiation, no strategy, just people fighting battles they didn't choose. Samantha was struck by the rawness in his voice. For all his wealth and power, Elliot Grayson seemed painfully aware of the limits of both. They ended the tour in the hospital's small garden, a quiet space filled with blooming flowers and benches. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and fresh. Elliot sat down on one of the benches, exhaling deeply. Thank you, he said, his voice soft. For what? For reminding me that the world doesn't revolve around boardrooms and profit margins, he said. I needed that. Samantha smiled faintly. You're welcome. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the tension between them easing. But just as Samantha thought they might have turned a corner, Elliot's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. I have to take this, he said, standing abruptly. His tone was clipped, the warmth from moments earlier gone. Samantha watched as he walked away, a sinking feeling settling in her chest. She knew better than to expect permanence, especially with someone like him. But it didn't make the distance any easier to bear. That night Samantha couldn't sleep. Her thoughts churned with fragments of their conversation, the way he'd opened up only to shut down again. She wanted to understand him, to help him, but how could she reach someone who'd spent his life building walls? Meanwhile, in his penthouse apartment, Elliot stared out at the city lights, the phone call replaying in his mind. His assistant had informed him of an impending scandal, a leaked story about his hospital stay, complete with speculation about Samantha. The tabloids were already spinning it into a tawdry narrative. This is why you don't get close, he muttered to himself, his fists clenched, because it always comes back to bite you. But even as he told himself to let go, to retreat into the safety of his solitude, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Samantha had seen him, not the billionaire, but the man beneath, and that terrified him. The next morning Elliot arrived at the hospital, his expression grim. He found Samantha in the break room, sipping a cup of coffee. She looked up, surprised to see him. We need to talk, he said. About what? She asked, setting her cup down. About this. He held up his phone, the screen displaying a headline, "Billionaire's Mystery Nurse, the Woman Who Tamed Elliot Grayson." Samantha's face paled. "I didn't. I know," he said quickly. "I know it wasn't you, but this is what happens when people get close to me. Their lives become collateral damage." "I'm not afraid of a few headlines," she said, her voice steady. "You should be," he replied. "Because this won't stop. The media, the speculation, it'll only get worse." "Maybe," she said, meeting his gaze. "But I'm more worried about what happens if you keep pushing people away." Elliot's jaw tightened, his defenses rising. "I'm doing this to protect you." "And I think you're lying," she said quietly. "I think you're scared." The words hit him like a blow, and for a moment he couldn't respond. Samantha stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to do this alone, Elliot," she said. "You don't have to keep running." He looked at her, torn between the desire to pull her closer and the instinct to push her away. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't control. And that terrified him more than any headline ever could. Elliot sat in the hospital's private conference room, the glow of a laptop screen casting harsh light across his face. His legal team had gone into overdrive, drafting statements to counter the tabloid frenzy. But their words felt hollow, nothing more than temporary patches for a ship that was sinking. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling under the surface. No matter how much he tried to control the narrative, the damage had been done. Worse still, he couldn't stop thinking about Samantha's face when she saw the headline, the hurt, the disbelief, and yet she hadn't backed down. She'd stood there, firm, daring him to let her in. The thought lingered as his assistant entered the room. "Sir, the situation is escalating," she said, placing a tablet in front of him. "Social media's running wild with theories. Some are even claiming you're engaged to her." Elliot exhaled sharply. "Let them talk." The assistant blinked, surprised. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Let them talk," he said, closing the laptop with a decisive click. "I'm done playing defense." She hesitated before nodding. "Understood." Elliot stood, his mind made up. He wasn't sure what he was about to do, but for the first time in years, he felt certain it was the right thing. Samantha paced the small break room, her emotions a whirlwind. The media circus was bad enough, but what stung more was Elliot's reaction. He had tried to push her away again, and yet she couldn't let go of the moments they had shared, the glimpses of the man beneath the walls. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Elliot standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. She folded her arms, trying to mask her turmoil. "I'm on my break." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For a moment they stood in silence, the air between them thick with tension. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, his voice quiet. "For what?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "For treating me like a problem to be managed? Or for running away the second things got hard?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't retreat. "For all of it. You were right, Samantha. I'm scared. Scared of what happens when I let someone in." Her defenses softened slightly, but she remained wary. "And now?" He took a step closer, his gaze steady. "Now I'm trying to do better. I don't want to push you away anymore." Samantha searched his face, looking for cracks in his resolve. What she found instead was sincerity, a vulnerability that felt like a victory in itself. "You can't just say the words, Elliot," she said softly. "You have to mean them." "I do," he said, his voice firm. "But you're right. I need to show you. So let me." Before she could respond, the intercom crackled to life, summoning her to the emergency ward. Samantha shot him an apologetic glance before hurrying out, leaving Elliot standing alone. The ER was in chaos when she arrived. A multiple car collision had flooded the hospital with patients, and the staff scrambled to triage the influx. Samantha threw herself into the work, moving from patient to patient with practiced efficiency. But even as she focused on the tasks at hand, her thoughts kept drifting back to Elliot. She didn't see him again until hours later, when she returned to the ward exhausted and disheveled. To her surprise, he was waiting outside her locker room, his suit jacket draped over one arm. "You should be resting," she said, too tired to mask her irritation. "I wanted to make sure you were okay," he said simply. Samantha sighed, leaning against the wall. "Why, Elliot? Why do you care?" "Because you're the first person who's made me want to be better," he admitted. "Not for appearances or for the media, but for myself, for you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Samantha looked at him, her defenses crumbling. She wanted to believe him, but she needed more. "What happens when this gets harder?" she asked. "When the media doesn't let up? When your condition makes things complicated?" Elliot stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then we figure it out, together." She searched his face, her heart pounding, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. Over the next few weeks, their lives became a delicate balancing act. The media frenzy showed no signs of slowing, but Elliot stood firm, refusing to let it dictate their choices. Samantha, in turn, found herself drawn deeper into his world, a world she had never imagined being a part of. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, of frustration, of fear, but there were also moments of joy, small, quiet victories that reminded them why they were fighting for this. One evening, as they sat on a bench in the hospital garden, Elliot reached for her hand. It was a small gesture, but it carried immense weight. "I've been working on something," he said, his tone hesitant. "For us." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" He pulled out a small device from his pocket, its sleek design unmistakably his. "It's a prototype," he explained, "a wearable that can regulate sensory input. It's not a cure, but it could help me tolerate touch." Samantha's breath caught. "Elliot, you did this for me?" "For us," he corrected, his voice soft. "I want to be able to hold your hand without fear, to give you the things you deserve." Tears pricked her eyes as she squeezed his hand gently. "You've already given me more than enough, Elliot." But as she looked at him, she knew he would never stop trying. Months later, the headlines had shifted. The world was still fascinated by Elliot Grayson and his mysterious nurse, but the speculation had taken a back seat to something else: admiration. The billionaire, once known for his aloofness, had become a champion for those with sensory disorders, funding research and developing technologies that changed lives. And through it all, Samantha remained by his side. Their relationship wasn't perfect. It was messy and complicated, filled with challenges neither of them could have anticipated, but it was also real, built on a foundation of trust and resilience. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of Elliot's penthouse, the city lights stretching out before them, he turned to her with a small smile. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Regret what?" she replied, tilting her head. "Letting me in," he said, his voice laced with vulnerability. She stepped closer, resting her hand on his chest. "Not for a second." Elliot's gaze softened as he pulled her into an embrace, the contact no longer foreign or frightening. It was progress, a testament to how far they had come. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Samantha couldn't help but marvel at the journey that had brought them here. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the one she wouldn't trade for anything, and for Elliot it was proof that even the most guarded hearts could find their way home.